"You're wrong," said the maid's son. In the midst of reading a billion-dollar will, his bold voice silenced the entire mansion and revealed a secret capable of changing the fate of the Ashford family forever. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel now to help us bring you more moving stories that impact lives. In the heart of the aristocratic neighborhood of Greenwich, Connecticut, stands the imposing Ashford Hall Mansion, a centuries-old stone palace where crystal chandeliers reflect memories of power and ambition. It is there, under the weight of the gilded portraits adorning the walls, that an extraordinary gathering takes place. Lawyers, family members, and investors don their finest suits and evening gowns to hear the reading of the will of Arthur Ashford, a hotel magnate and owner of a fortune estimated in the billions. The atmosphere is dense, almost suffocating, where every glance carries a mixture of hope, greed, and distrust. Everyone knows that that night would not just change the numbers in a bank account, it would change entire destinies. As guests discreetly adjust their seats around the long, solid oak table, whispers ripple through the room like tiny sparks about to ignite a powder keg. Some already speak of travels, properties, and titles that, in their minds, already belong to them. Others, more reserved, hide their anxiety behind cold expressions, as if unmoved by the desire to inherit. But all share the same thought. When the reading is over, there will be winners and losers, and no one is willing to be second. However, behind the glitter of the crystal glasses and the pomp of the occasion, an unseen detail threatens to upend a seemingly predictable game. The metallic sound of an antique clock echoes through the room, marking each second like a countdown. Eyes turn to the lawyer, Dr. Samuel Whitaker, who adjusts his glasses on his nose and opens the leather briefcase containing the most anticipated document of the evening. The room sinks into a heavy silence, as if even the portraits on the walls are waiting to witness the fate of the Ashford fortune. What no one imagines is that, hidden among legal clauses and flowery words, lies a secret capable of changing everything. And the first to realize it will not be an heir, but someone who should never have had a voice in that room. Arthur Ashford was a man whose presence seemed to shape the very air in any room he entered. Founder of the international hotel chain Ashford International, he built an empire that stretched from Europe to Asia, erecting glass towers where once there had been only vacant lots. His career, celebrated in magazines and headlines, was shrouded in mystery and military discipline. The son of a humble doorman, Arthur never forgot his childhood spent in orphanages and cheap boarding schools, but he transformed his scars into weapons to dominate the market. His blue eyes, always cold, hid secrets that few dared decipher. Now, after his sudden death at the age of 76, the question that hung like a shadow over that night remained. Who would inherit the throne left by a man who never tolerated weakness? On the table, sealed documents held more than assets. They held power. The sums were almost unimaginable: seaside resorts, airline stakes, art collections valued in the hundreds of millions, properties spread from Paris to Dubai. But there was something even more valuable than all of this: a controlling stake in the holding company Ashford International, the key to dictating the corporation's future on a global scale. For many there, that piece of paper meant more than jewels or mansions. It meant the chance to become untouchable. Dr. Samuel Whitaker, the family's experienced lawyer, arranged each sheet with an almost sacred ritual, as if he already knew that soon every word would be fought over like blood in an arena. And it was at that point that the air grew even heavier, for no one suspected that a silent clause was about to transform that room into a war zone. Among those present, the favorite heir was Gregory Ashford, the eldest son, whose arrogance recalled his father's in his prime. Dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, he made no secret of his anticipation of taking over the empire. Whispers suggested that Gregory had already prepared speeches for investors, and even hired image consultants to present himself as the new face of the corporation. Around him, other heirs, distant cousins, resentful nephews, and children from second marriages sharpened their eyes, ready to challenge any detail that left them out. But none of them even considered glancing at the back of the room, where Elena Ruiz and her 13-year-old son, Mateo Ruiz, sat discreetly. Invisible to the elite, they were unaware that, in moments, they would be the spark of a turnaround no one could control. The main hall of Ashford Hall seemed prepared for a theatrical spectacle of power. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the family's inherited tapestries, while the golden glow of the mirrors reflected every gesture of those present. Crystal goblets filled with imported wine sat on the oak table, but few touched them, fearing any distraction would make them miss a crucial detail of the reading. The antique portraits of the Ashford ancestors, in heavy frames, watched everyone with painted eyes that seemed to carry silent judgment. Every object in the hall, from the Chinese porcelain vases to the Persian rug beneath the lawyer's feet, exuded the idea that wealth here was not only material, but also symbolic. Yet, behind the opulence, the atmosphere was one of undeclared war. Everyone waited for the will to be read to begin the battle. As the guests settled into their leather chairs, whispers slithered through the room like invisible serpents. Some ladies in long dresses exchanged nervous glances, while young heirs, their ties still ill-fitting, drummed their fingers impatiently. The air seemed to vibrate with a silent electricity, where every second was torture for those who believed they were entitled to more than they would receive. Some were already mentally crunching numbers, dividing up properties and appraising jewelry, as if the document were merely a formality. But amid the whispers, there were also suspicious glances directed at the lawyer, as if Samuel Whitaker might manipulate the words to someone's advantage. With each held breath, the feeling grew that night, the reading of the will would not just be a ceremony, but a battle disguised as solemnity. At the far end of the room, Gregory Ashford exuded absolute confidence, which only increased the resentment of the others. He smiled discreetly, as if already savoring the moment of taking over the empire. His brothers and cousins, however, exchanged glances filled with envy and irritation. What no one imagined was that all this dispute between them would be merely a smokescreen, because the real trigger for the conflict was about to emerge from where they least expected it. And in that room packed with lawyers and vain relatives, no one noticed the attentive gaze of Mateo Ruiz, the maid's son, who followed every word as if it were a hidden key. The boy didn't know it yet, but he was about to tear away the veil of hypocrisy that held the room together, and expose a detail capable of turning everyone against everyone. The double doors to the ballroom opened slowly, creaking as if the mansion itself felt the weight of the occasion. Dr. Samuel Whitaker, the family's trusted attorney for over 3 decades, entered with firm steps, carrying under his arm a dark leather briefcase that seemed heavier than any briefcase ever carried. His serious, almost expressionless expression conveyed authority and neutrality, like a judge about to pronounce a sentence. The silence that spread through the room was immediate. Even the glasses stopped clinking. He walked to the head of the table, placed the briefcase before him, and took his glasses from his jacket pocket, adjusting them with a meticulous gesture. Everyone knew that this man held in his hands the power to shape the future of every person present. But what no one expected was that not even he was prepared for what would unfold that night. With a calculated gesture, Samuel opened the folder, revealing a neat stack of bound, stamped, and precisely numbered documents. The sound of the paper sliding against the table echoed through the room, as if each sheet carried an invisible weight. The lawyer discreetly cleared his throat and, before beginning, cast a stern look at the heirs, as if reminding them that he would not tolerate interruptions or disrespect. The first words were charged with solemnity. By the will of the late Arthur Ashford, This document contains his last will and testament, drawn up and notarized in an irrevocable manner. A murmur ran through the room, muffled but audible, as if everyone sensed the gravity of the moment. And as Samuel arranged his sheets to begin reading, an almost palpable tension hung in the air, as if everyone was awaiting not just numbers, but revelations capable of shattering reputations. Eyes automatically turned to Gregory Ashford, who maintained his confident posture, arms crossed, and a slight smile of superiority plastered across his face. For him, this was simply confirmation of something he already believed was written. The power of Ashford International was finally in his hands. Some relatives looked away in envy, others clenched their fists in silent frustration. But in the background, Mateo Ruiz, sitting discreetly beside his mother, kept his eyes fixed on the lawyer and the papers on the table. The 13-year-old, accustomed to observing silently while cleaning shelves and aisles alongside Elena, seemed to grasp every detail with unusual attention. Samuel, as he licked his lips and prepared to read the first article of the will, had no idea that, in just a few pages, he would be forced to interrupt the ceremony because of someone who should never have been in that room. While the invisible spotlight focused on the heirs with the heavy surname, almost no one noticed the discreet figure of Elena Ruiz, the mansion's housekeeper. At 36, she wore an impeccably pressed blue uniform, yellow gloves protecting her calloused hands, and a tight bun that hid the unruly strands of her brown hair. Her brown eyes held the serenity of someone who had learned to live in the shadow of power, always invisible, always silent. Beside her, clutching a worn notebook to her chest, was Mateo Ruiz, her 13-year-old son. The boy wore clothes far too simple for the setting: a worn cotton shirt, slightly short pants, and sneakers that betrayed the miles he'd walked to public school. They occupied two modest chairs near the glass window overlooking the gardens, as if they were just part of the forgotten decor. But the evening would prove that even the invisible could become the center of history. Elena kept her gaze downcast, worried about attracting attention. He was aware that being there with Mateo was a risk. Suspicious relatives might consider him an intruder, and Gregory Ashford, in particular, couldn't stand outsiders witnessing the family's affairs. Still, Elena had no choice. There was no one to leave her son with that night, and deep down, she believed that if she remained silent, he would go unnoticed. But Mateo was no ordinary boy. From an early age, he harbored an almost insatiable curiosity for books, languages, and hidden histories. He spent entire afternoons in public libraries, copying passages from textbooks and memorizing expressions in foreign languages that no one in the Ashford family would have imagined he knew. Now, his eyes roamed every face, every gesture, and above all, every page of the will on the table, as if fate had given him a riddle to decipher. Noticing her son's attentive interest, Elena placed her hand gently on Mateo's arm, a silent reminder that silence was his only protection. But the boy merely smiled faintly, as if harboring a secret that could not yet be revealed. Attorney Samuel Whitaker began the reading in a firm voice, the solemn cadence of his words filling the room with an almost religious weight. With each sentence, the heirs held their breath, waiting for the moment their names would appear. However, while the adults lost themselves in anticipation and rivalry, Mateo discreetly jotted notes in his notebook, comparing words, noticing details that even the lawyer had missed. Elena, restless, had no idea that, at that very moment, her son was about to become the key to a mystery capable of turning that night upside down. Dr. Samuel Whitaker's voice echoed through the hall like a subdued thunderclap, each word laden with the weight of legality and Ashford family history. I, Arthur Ashford, in good standing, do hereby direct that my inheritance be distributed as herein set forth. The lawyer ran through the first few pages, describing donations to charities, scholarship funds, and even the maintenance of the children's hospital that bore the family name. Some heirs frowned at what they considered a waste of assets. But for the investors present, these clauses were merely a formality before what truly mattered: the division of the empire. Each sentence read felt like a stepping stone toward the climax, and it was impossible not to notice the way Gregory's eyes sparkled, as if the document confirmed the crown already resting upon his head. What no one realized was that, hidden within those bureaucratic lines, there was a detail that would yet change the entire trajectory of that room. When the first family names finally emerged, the atmosphere became almost electric. Gregory Ashford received initial mentions of properties on the French Riviera, as well as parts of art collections valued in the millions. Distant cousins received country homes and smaller stakes in subsidiary companies. Some smiled discreetly, while others clenched their fists in frustration. With each name mentioned, tension grew between relatives who feigned cordiality but hid long-standing resentments. Samuel read with practiced calm, but his expression showed a careful attempt not to misspell a single word. In Mateo Ruiz's attentive eyes, however, something was already catching attention. The boy was scribbling specific words in his notebook, legal terms he vaguely recognized from his studies in old library books. Elena, at his side, noticed her son's concentration, but she had no idea that those innocent notes would spark something unimaginable. The lawyer paused briefly, clearing his throat, before turning another page. The dry sound of the paper being turned echoed through the room like a snap. Samuel cleared his throat and, adjusting his glasses, announced that the next clauses would address the controlling interest in the holding company Ashford International. The hearts of many heirs raced at that moment. Gregory uncrossed his arms and leaned forward, as if preparing to receive what he had always believed to be his destiny. But it was precisely at this point that Mateo noticed something unusual, a confusing formulation, an expression in legal Latin that seemed at odds with the rest of the text. He tilted his head discreetly, trying to follow the reading, and with each word, silently confirmed that something was amiss. And while everyone waited only for Gregory's coronation, an invisible boy in the background already sensed that this reading was about to reveal much more than anyone expected. As the assets were enumerated, the room seemed to transform into a silent arena. Gregory Ashford, seated at the head of the room, greeted each mention of his name with a slight smile of triumph, as if he had already anticipated every line. The cousins murmured among themselves, some with suppressed tears of frustration, others with envious glances at their eldest son. One of the nephews, unable to contain himself, let out a sharp comment, quickly silenced by Samuel Whitaker's stern gaze. The tension was palpable. Each heir, in their mind, calculated values, influence, and territories gained or lost. But while the room stirred with petty emotions, a pair of youthful eyes remained fixed on the lawyer's words, perceiving what no one else dared to see. Gregory, filled with his usual confidence, leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs with the air of someone who already owned the entire room. For him, the will was no surprise, but merely a ritual to formalize what he had always believed inevitable: his dominion over the Ashford Empire. His half-brother, sitting a few seats ahead, bit his lip angrily, while one of his aunts gave him a look of pure contempt, recalling old family feuds. With each reaction, the internal division became more evident, revealing cracks that Arthur Ashford had likely foreseen when he wrote his last will and testament. Samuel, noticing the heated looks, maintained his neutral posture, but deep inside, he already felt the discomfort of sitting on a bomb about to explode. And it was precisely this unstable ground that would become the perfect stage for the revelation that was to come. In the corner of the room, Elena Ruiz watched silently, her fingers intertwined in her lap, as if praying for the evening to end without further humiliation. Beside her, Mateo Ruiz continued to scribble in his notebook, his eyes darting between the lawyer's words and the text projected on the screen for everyone to follow. While the adults drowned in greed, he noticed something strange, a paragraph whose structure didn't fit with the rest. With each new sentence, his conviction grew, though so did his fear of what it meant. Mateo glanced discreetly at his mother, as if seeking courage in her silence, but he held the notebook tightly in his hands. He still didn't know how or when, but a certainty was forming in his mind. Soon, he would have to break the order of that room. The hall fell into a thick silence as Dr. Samuel Whitaker turned another page of the will. His voice, previously firm and controlled, wavered briefly as he read a section written in archaic terms, filled with legal Latin expressions and clauses too long to be easily understood. The heirs, accustomed to clear numbers and listed properties, frowned, exchanging suspicious glances. Gregory, still confident, maintained his smile, certain that any obscure detail worked in his favor. But in Mateo Ruiz's eyes, the lawyer's change in tone sounded like a warning. The boy leaned forward, peering closely at the words projected on the screen and sensing something different. As Samuel read aloud, his cadence became less confident, as if even he was hesitant to interpret the passage correctly. Some of the heirs chuckled, believing it to be just another demonstration of Arthur Ashford's meticulousness, known for leaving no loopholes in his business dealings. But Mateo knew better. He recognized some of the Latin, the fruit of hours poring over old books he'd found in the public library. As he followed the reading in his mind, he realized that the clause not only spoke of the transfer of assets, but also contained specific conditions regarding the allocation of a significant portion of the fortune. He clutched the notebook to his chest, his breathing quickening, his heart pounding with the certainty that this detail had the power to overturn all the certainties displayed in the room. Gregory, impatient with the delay and the confused tone of the reading, tapped his fingers on the arm of the chair, demanding that the lawyer be more direct. "Go on, Whitaker," he said, his tone cold, as if he were in command. The lawyer cleared his throat and tried to continue, but stumbled over a few words, quickly consulting his notes. It was at that moment that Mateo's eyes lit up. The boy realized what was implicitly written. The true heir to control would not only be those of Ashford blood, but also those who fulfill the conditions set by the patriarch. Elena, beside her son, noticed the tension in his eyes and tugged discreetly at his arm, asking for silence. But Mateo already knew he wouldn't be able to remain silent for long, because that clause, ignored by everyone, carried within it the power to radically change the fate of an entire family. Dr. Samuel Whitaker's words began to stumble over the very formality of the will. He adjusted his glasses with each line, quickly consulting supporting documents, as if unsure of how to proceed. The heirs, who had previously remained respectfully silent, began to grow restless. One of the cousins murmured, "This doesn't make sense," while an uncle raised his voice, demanding that Samuel translate the terms clearly and directly. The lawyer, visibly uncomfortable, tried to explain that the clause was difficult to interpret, but his hesitation only fueled suspicion. Gregory seized the opportunity to assert himself, lifting his chin and declaring the passage merely unnecessary legalese, attempting to close the matter. But unease hung in the air, and many already sensed that something was hidden within those lines. The buzz grew. Some family members accused Whitaker of withholding information. Others pressed him to read it again, word for word. The lawyer took a deep breath, running a hand over his sweaty forehead, trying to maintain an authoritative tone. "Gentlemen, please remain calm. The passage is legitimate and notarized. It simply requires careful interpretation," he said, but his voice trembled. Elena Ruiz, watching from the side of the room, felt the pressure build like a wave about to break. Beside her, Mateo Ruiz kept his notebook open, his eyes darting over his notes and the projected screen. recognizing terms the lawyers seemed to ignore. With every word, the boy confirmed his suspicion. That clause changed everything. His heart pounded, as if destiny were calling to him. Gregory slammed his hand against the oak table, his voice echoing arrogantly through the room. "Whitaker, enough beating around the bush. Continue reading. This inheritance is mine. Everyone here knows it." The room divided between those who agreed with him and those who demanded transparency. Samuel, under pressure, quickly skimmed over sections that explained nothing, trying to regain control of the reading. But the emptiness of his words only increased the uneasiness. Suspicious glances met, and the tension was almost unbearable. It was at that moment that Mateo slowly closed the notebook, took a deep breath, and kept his eyes fixed on the lawyer. He knew he was facing a precipice. Remain silent and let the injustice be confirmed, or raise his voice and challenge this entire room of powerful men. And, deep down, he already knew what decision he would make. The room descended into subdued chaos. Voices overlapped. Accusations flew from one side of the table to the other, and attorney Samuel Whitaker could no longer maintain control of his reading. In this whirlwind of words and distrust, an unexpected voice broke through the barrier of invisibility. Mateo Ruiz, the 13-year-old boy sitting next to his mother, slowly rose from his chair. His voice was not loud, but clear enough to echo amid the hubbub. "You're wrong." The silence that followed was immediate, almost brutal. All eyes, filled with disbelief, turned to him like sharp blades. Elena clapped her hands to her mouth in horror, unable to believe her son had dared speak in forbidden territory. Gregory Ashford was the first to react, laughing scornfully and shaking his head as if he'd heard the most foolish thing of the night. "A boy? A maid's son dares correct the Ashford family lawyer," he mocked, his voice echoing with sarcasm. Other family members laughed along, some nervously, some cruelly, as if this moment were merely comic relief amidst the tension. Elena tried to pull Mateo's arm to make him sit down, but the boy remained firm, his fingers still clutching the notebook to his chest. His face flushed, but his eyes burned with unshakable conviction. It was as if all the nights he'd spent studying in silence had prepared him for this unique moment. The laughter in the room continued, but behind it, a seed of curiosity was already sprouting. The lawyer, visibly embarrassed, cleared his throat and tried to ignore the interruption, but something in Mateo's posture made him hesitate. The boy took a deep breath, took a step forward, and repeated, this time more firmly, "You're wrong. That clause doesn't mean what you just said." The words fell like stones to the marble floor, creating a charged silence. Samuel Whitaker, confused, glanced quickly at the papers, while the family exchanged looks of surprise and indignation. Gregory snorted, preparing to ridicule the boy further, but the conviction in Mateo's voice stirred something uncomfortable, almost disturbing. For the first time that night, it wasn't just laughter that echoed, but also a thread of doubt that began to grow within those walls. Mateo Ruiz's statement seemed to have torn through the veil of solemnity that had previously dominated the hall. For a few seconds, silence reigned like a punch to the collective gut, but soon disbelief turned to laughter among the heirs. Gregory Ashford clapped his hands slowly, with a smile laden with sarcasm, as if watching a comedy staged solely for his enjoyment. "Well, look at that. The maid's son now thinks he can dictate the rules of a will," he exclaimed, provoking more laughter from those eager to please him. Elena, cowering in her chair, felt her face burn with shame and fear, wishing she would disappear in the face of such mockery. But Mateo, steadfast, didn't back down a step, and his stance began to irritate even those who were laughing. The jeers grew louder. One of the aunts, waving her fan dismissively, muttered that such boldness was proof of the lack of education of those who don't know their place. Another younger cousin laughed out loud, asking if the boy had learned law and order In the hallways his mother scrubbed with buckets and brooms. The words were like knives thrust at the boy, each one laden with prejudice and humiliation. Yet, amidst this barrage of sarcasm, some began to exchange uncertain glances, as if Mateo's courage aroused a strange sense of unease. It wasn't common for someone so young to defy such a hostile environment. And behind the laughter, a silent fissure was already forming, the fear that the boy might be right. Samuel Whitaker, pressured by the stares and laughter, tried to regain his authority. "Gentlemen, let us maintain order. We must not listen to undue interruptions," he said, his voice thick with tension. But at the same time, he couldn't shake the firmness in Mateo's voice. The boy didn't seem to be joking or trying to get attention. There was conviction in every word he uttered. Elena held her son's hand tightly, as if silently begging him to give up before he was humiliated further. But Mateo's determined gaze made it clear he would not back down. And as the laughter echoed through the room, the feeling that was forming, almost imperceptibly, was that the boy's next words could silence even the most arrogant. The laughter still echoed through the hall when Elena Ruiz hurriedly rose from her chair, her heart racing and her hands trembling. Her maternal instincts spoke louder than any fear. "Please forgive my son. He meant no disrespect to this ceremony," she said, her voice breaking, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to escape. The scornful glances turned to her, as if her mere presence were an affront to this elite. Elena gripped Mateo's arm tightly, trying to make him sit down, whispering for him to be quiet before it was too late. But the boy remained firm, his eyes fixed on the documents, as if he saw there a truth no one else dared. The awkward silence that followed her words only reinforced the social chasm that separated mother and son from the others present. Gregory Ashford didn't miss the opportunity to reinforce the humiliation. He rose from his chair, raised his wine glass, and declared sarcastically, "Look, gentlemen, it's not enough that the boy thinks he's a lawyer. Now the maid wants to pose as the guardian of the family honor." Laughter echoed again, and some guests nodded in agreement, as if this were just further confirmation that the Ruiz's audacity was ridiculous. Elena felt her blood boil, but she stood tall, proud despite her shame. She knew every word against her son was like a whip, but she also knew she couldn't protect him from it forever. As she held her trembling hands in her lap, she understood that, no matter how painful it was, Mateo wouldn't back down. And his courage was beginning to shine through in a way that could no longer be ignored. Attorney Samuel Whitaker, uncomfortable with the direction of the meeting, cleared his throat and tried to return to his text, but the tension was uncontrollable. Elena looked at her son with desperation in her eyes, silently begging him to leave this behind, to return to the safe invisibility they were accustomed to. But Mateo took a deep breath, his fingers gliding over the notes in his notebook, and stared at the lawyer as if he had been born for this moment. "Mom, I know what I'm saying," he murmured softly, but enough to make her shiver. The glint of determination in his eyes wasn't childish, it was certainty. And in that instant, Elena realized with a mixture of fear and pride that she couldn't stop him. Her son was about to challenge not just Gregory, but the entire empire Arthur Ashford had built. Gregory's laughter still echoed through the room when Mateo Ruiz stepped forward, raising his notebook to his chest like a shield. His eyes met Samuel Whitaker's, and in a firm voice, he said, "That clause, it doesn't automatically hand over control of Ashford International. There's a condition no one mentioned." The room erupted in murmurs, some mocking, others simply curious at the boy's boldness. Samuel adjusted his glasses in confusion, staring again at the passage he'd read. Elena clutched her hands tightly in panic, but it was too late. Mateo had decided to face the entire room. And in that instant, the expectant silence spread, as if everyone was waiting to hear if the boy would have the courage to continue. "It's written here," Mateo continued, pointing to the screen where the words in legal Latin still glowed under the projector's light. Arthur Ashford has determined that the true heir may only assume control if he maintains the institution that formed him, the St. Bartholomew's Orphanage, where he himself grew up. A shock swept through the room like an invisible wave. Many heirs looked at each other in confusion, not even remembering that Arthur had come from such humble beginnings. Gregory laughed out loud, trying to muffle the shock of the revelation. Lies. He doesn't know what he's talking about. A kid can't interpret better than renowned lawyers. But Matteo's voice didn't waver, and each word seemed to carry more weight than the favored heir's laughter. Samuel, now sweating, quickly scanned the documents with his finger, following Matteo's reading. His eyes widened, and the silence that followed was devastating. The boy was right. The clause really existed, hidden amid the jumbled lines, and it was unequivocal. My God, the lawyer muttered, unaware he was speaking aloud. The family members erupted in screams. Some demanded explanations. Others accused Whitaker of negligence. Gregory stood up furiously, his face red with rage, pointing at Matteo as if he were an intruder who had ruined everything. But deep down, even amid the screams and accusations, loomed an impossible truth. The invisible boy had ripped off the mask of the greed that dominated the room, and no one was prepared to deal with it. The hall, which had previously vibrated with laughter and sarcasm, fell into a heavy, uncomfortable silence. The distant sound of wind hitting the glass windows was the only thing that filled the space for a few endless seconds. Samuel Whitaker, still stunned, quietly repeated the words of the document, confirming before everyone what Matteo Ruiz had just revealed. The maintenance of the St. Bartholomew Orphanage, an irrevocable condition for the ownership of Ashford International. The words echoed like hammer blows on iron, shattering certainties and raising doubts on every face present. Some heirs' hands trembled on the table, while others stood abruptly, unable to hide their fury. The revelation made it clear that Arthur Ashford had prepared a final test, and no one knew if they would have the courage to meet it. Gregory Ashford, overcome with almost uncontrollable rage, slammed his fists against the table, shaking the crystal glasses. This is absurd. An insignificant detail can't change the fate of the company, he shouted, his voice thick with fury and despair. But deep down, everyone knew it wasn't insignificant. Some lawyers present were already whispering that the clause was legally binding. Gregory's pride was beginning to crumble before everyone's eyes, and his image as the inevitable heir was now under attack. Elena, her heart still racing, watched her son with suppressed tears, feeling a mixture of fear and pride. She understood that from that moment on, the room would never see him as a mere invisible boy, and every second seemed only to deepen the tension, as if an inevitable confrontation were about to erupt. Voices overlapped in a whirlwind of accusations and despair. Some relatives demanded the will be annulled. Others questioned the lawyer about how such an important detail had gone unnoticed. Samuel Whitaker, visibly cornered, raised his hands for calm, but his voice no longer held the same authority. The weight of the truth revealed by a 13-year-old boy was undeniable, and everyone was forced to face reality. The fortune did not belong to those who believed they were born with that right, but to those who had the courage to honor the patriarch's memory. At the back of the room, Matteo Ruiz remained standing, breathing deeply, as if he were holding in his hands the explosion no one could prevent. And Gregory's furious gaze, now fixed on him, made it clear that the next reaction would not be mere words. Gregory Ashford's face was red, almost purple, as he rose from his chair like a cornered beast. His blue eyes, once full of confidence, now reflected hatred and despair. "Are you really going to believe a boy?" he shouted, pointing an accusing finger at Matteo Ruiz, who stood firm. The words echoed through the hall, but they no longer held the same force. The heir who had always been feared and respected now seemed like a man on the verge of collapse. Some relatives looked away in shame, while others glanced at each other, as if seeing, for the first time, the fragility of the one who had believed himself invincible. Gregory's empire, built on expectation and arrogance, was beginning to crumble before everyone's eyes. Trying to regain control, Gregory advanced on the desk, snatching the papers from Samuel Whitaker's hands and leafing through them haphazardly. "No, it can't be true. There must be some mistake," he repeated, his voice trembling, almost pleading. The lawyer tried to intervene, but was pushed aside, his decades-old dignity crushed by the heir's desperation. The awkward silence that followed was even crueler than the previous laughter. Gregory, always so proud, was being seen as unbalanced, incapable of accepting the truth. And each desperate gesture only reinforced the humiliation everyone was witnessing. Matteo, still clutching the notebook to his chest, watched silently, understanding that he didn't need to say anything else. Gregory's own fury was proof of his defeat. Some foreign investors, invited to attend the reading, stood discreetly, shaking their heads in disapproval. One of them muttered under his breath, "Unacceptable. He's unfit to lead." These words were like daggers to Gregory's heart, who realized, for the first time, that his public image was also being destroyed. Elena fought back tears, aware that her son had irreversibly changed the course of that night. Samuel, composed, gathered up the papers with firm hands and declared before everyone, "The clause is legitimate, and no one, not even Gregory Ashford, can nullify it." The final blow was struck, and in the back of the room, the echo of humiliation resounded louder than any inheritance. Gregory was no longer the undisputed heir, and his downfall was now public and irreversible. The silence following Gregory Ashford's fall was filled with something unexpected, a quiet applause that rose from one end of the table and quickly multiplied. Investors and lawyers clapped, not just for the legal outcome, but for the courage of the boy who had dared to say what no one had the courage to admit. Matteo Ruiz, still clutching his worn notebook, felt his hands tremble, but he kept his gaze steady. His brown eyes reflected not vanity, but the serenity of someone who had simply revealed the truth. Elena Ruiz, beside him, finally let a tear fall, not of shame, but of pride. For the first time, she was not just the mansion's invisible maid, but the mother of a boy who had changed the course of an entire family. Samuel Whitaker regained his composure and, in a firm voice, declared, "The will is clear. The condition left by Arthur Ashford must be respected. Whoever takes over the Ashford empire must keep the St. Bartholomew's orphanage alive, exactly as he wished." The words echoed like a final sentence, erasing any doubt or resistance. The heirs' faces varied between shock, revolt, and helplessness. Gregory, defeated, retreated to the back of the hall, unable to face the eyes that now judged him. However, in the background, all eyes were fixed not on the titles and figures, but on the boy who had dared to raise his voice. It was impossible to deny. That night, the most talked-about name inside Ashford Hall was not Gregory's, nor Samuel's, but Matteo's. The immense crystal chandelier reflected the scene as if recording a historic milestone in its silent memory. There, amid renowned lawyers and millionaire heirs, a poor boy became a symbol of courage and dignity. Elena lifted her face, feeling that, for the first time, her place in that mansion was not one of shadow, but of light. Matteo remained silent, but his erect posture and the firmness in his gaze already spoke louder than any speech. That night would not be remembered for the jewels or the listed properties, but for the lesson that would echo for generations. Truth can emerge from where least expected, and power can crumble before the courage of a humble heart. And so, in the heart of the Ashford family, what should have been merely the reading of a will became a twist of fate, and an invisible boy became the protagonist of an unforgettable story. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel now, activate the bell, and share. This way, you'll help us bring you more moving stories that impact and transform lives. Thank you so much for your support.